muscle strength and keeping our musculoskeletal system healthy and strong, that's when we can make the biggest impact in aging.
Hey there, welcome to the Evolving Ageless podcast. This is the Enlightened Woman's Antidote to Aging. I am your host, Michelle Dreilich, and remember, I am on a mission to change the way women age. So each week, I'm joined by experts around the country, around the world, that share their experiences and their latest research and what's working in their clinics. So today is a really exciting topic and a wonderfully exciting guest. I just want to welcome Elke Cooke to Evolving Ageless. Hi, Elka, how are you?
Hi, Michelle. I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me. This topic is near and dear to my heart, actually.
Well, we are kindred spirits on this one because we are going to talk quite a bit about muscle health and aging and our hormone balancing during perimenopause and menopause. But first, I want to tell you what a rock star Dr. Cooke is. So, first of all, she's from the University of Michigan. Whoop, whoop. That's where my husband went to school. And so we already did our Go Blue this morning.
yeah.
But she did her residency and her medical training at the University of Michigan and has spent her first 8 years working as an emergency physician at Kaiser Permanente in Northern California. But like so many physicians that I've met in functional medicine, uh, practicing medicine, doing what you were trained to do and not seeing the results that you see or that you would know that your patients can get are what really led her to functional medicine, and has since completed the advanced fellowship for A4M, right? The American Academy of Anti-Aging Medicine.
That's right. Yeah.
That's wonderful. So she's been featured in Forbes and Prevention and Brit and Company, so among other publications. So I'm super excited to have you here. And I want to jump in with this idea that we talk about all the time, but I know you've got a different spin on it where we talk about muscle as the antidote to aging and how wrinkles and sagging skin, although we think of them as women as our first signs of aging, they're actually not. They're just symptoms of what's been brewing on the inside. So
That's right.
you said that muscle is our metabolic currency. So I would love for you to explain that because that's a really cool idea.
Yeah. Thanks, Michelle. So in my clinic, I would say the majority of women are in their perimenopause and menopause age. But actually, recently, over the last several years, I've also been seeing more and more young women who are going into perimenopause a lot earlier. And I think what's really important for women to understand is that we're in menopause perimenopause long before symptoms become apparent on the outside. So many women are in perimenopause for 5 years or even up to a decade before we actually notice the symptoms of dropping our periods or our cycles getting longer. So I think that's a very important aspect to understand, that perimenopause goes on for years, and how we even go into perimenopause is set up even decades before that. So I think it's really important to understand that our lifestyle, how we work, how we train, our mindset really sets us up for success as we start to lose our hormones. And as I've worked with women over many years in my functional medicine clinic, the number one complaint that I get is that they lose control over their body composition. They want to lose weight, but they can't anymore, even though they do everything right. They eat right, they train really hard, and they start to train even harder and eat less, and yet they cannot lose any weight. And I've noticed that when we focus on muscle strength and keeping our musculoskeletal system healthy and strong, that's when we can make the biggest impact in aging for women.
So this is huge, okay, because I think it's a common theme. I've heard it for decades in patient care where women get around 50, right? And I have to put myself in that bucket. The same exact thing happened to me where I actually sort of thought my patients were maybe just their eating was a little bit out of control. Maybe they weren't working out. They hadn't dialed in their nutrition. Their workouts had waned. But in reality, that's not the case. There are actual physiological things that change that can cause this slowdown where and I've seen it time and time again, right? Where there will be women that were fasting and don't lose weight, right? And they don't understand it. So then they eat less and less. And before you know it, there are these little bird plates. Even our grandparents, my grandmother, I remember, would eat just such tiny bits of food. And I would think, that doesn't seem right. And she said, you'll understand when you get older.
You can get yourself into more and more trouble. You work out harder with higher intensity, you get your cortisol levels up, which actually sets you up for more muscle loss and body breakdown because it's a catabolic hormone. You eat less, which also in turn can increase your cortisol. And especially for women, I'm all in favor of intermittent fasting and
Mhm.
the overnight fasting, the prolonged fasting, but I've seen it backfire specifically for women. And it just has to do with hormonally how we're set up. We're much more complicated than men. And a lot of the research on fasting also has been done on men. And I think we're just now finding out that what's true for men and what works for men isn't necessarily true for women. So we have to
That
take
is so powerful. What works for men is not true for women necessarily, right? So let's talk about that. Let's talk about what happens, in our 40s, how we start to move toward these metabolic changes and hormonal changes and what's happening in the muscle.
That's right. Yeah. So just think about how in our 40s, it's almost like the perfect storm. As a woman, you come into your 40s many times already depleted because of several pregnancies, right? So you've gone through one, two, three, or more pregnancies. You lose a lot of nutritional stamina that way. Then sleep deprivation, taking care of family, you might work an 8-hour job. In your 40s, you're at the peak of your career, right? You're trying to keep up, you're keeping up with men. It's the perfect storm. It's, we're also isolated as women. We compare ourselves on Instagram. There's not that circle of women. So just think about how you even arrive in your 40s and in your 50s. And then in addition to that, now all of a sudden your hormones are starting to slowly decline. And specifically for women, of course, we think about estrogen, and I'll go into that. Estrogen is very important even when it comes to muscle mass, but also progesterone, which is our brain hormone, our sleep, our relaxation hormone, and testosterone. Testosterone, even though only a small fragment of we have a small fragment of what men have, but it's also a very important hormone for women. So we arrive in our 40s, very much depleted and stressed out, and now our hormones are declining. And so what do we start to notice? We're fatigued, we gain weight, we lose control over our body composition, and we try harder and harder and harder, and it's not working. And the key, I think, is to really start looking at your hormonal balance. Look at your cortisol levels, look at your estrogen levels. So estrogen is such an important hormone, even when it comes to muscle. With declining estrogen, we become more and more insulin resistant. So the less estrogen we have, the more insulin your body has to make in order to keep your blood sugar fairly stable. But insulin is the major fat storage hormone. So the more insulin you make, the more fat your body will hang on to. Estrogen is a very important aspect of our body composition. Estrogen also, and I think this is not very well known, but estrogen also increases the heat shock proteins. And there's a lot of talk about heat shock proteins right now in hormesis and, for example, going into the sauna, trying to increase your heat shock proteins as they're protective and they, promote anti-aging in women. But the more estrogen we have, the more heat shock protein, HSP70, for example, protects our membranes and helps us to build protein. And then protein, super important for muscle immunity, gut integrity. So estrogen plays an important role when it comes to heat shock proteins and muscle composition as well.
So let's talk about that for a second. Heat shock proteins live in the muscle primarily. Is that
Right.
true?
Yes.
Okay. And so by increasing our body temperature from the external, like outside in, whether that's a sauna or something like that, explain it just a little bit more, because these are new to me. I've not heard a whole lot of heat shock. I've heard biohackers, right? Mostly
Right.
men talking about biohacking, and so I want us to understand what it means for women and how that relates to it. So this is so important and so interesting.
Right. Yeah. So we've been using these biohacking tools, such as going into the sauna, but also cold water immersion, or going into these ice cold environments that actually increase our heat shock proteins, which then help our bodies to keep our membranes stable in each and every cell of our body. But they also help to build our protein. And
Which
so,
is what muscle's made of,
which is what muscle
right?
is made of, but which is also what our gut lining is made of. So they're really important for gut integrity. So estrogen, keeping your estrogen balanced, is just another biohacking tool, so to speak, to keep your heat shock proteins up. Estrogen also helps with fatty acid oxidation. So what does that mean? So as we eat fat, we need to oxidize these fatty acids. We need to utilize them in our mitochondria so that the macronutrient of fat can be converted into ATP, into energy.
Mm-hmm.
When this mechanism doesn't take place, the fat that we're eating is then stored, as in muscle fat around our bellies, for example, or around our hips. So
Mm-hmm.
estrogen also helps us with this utilization, this fatty acid oxidation of the food that we eat.
That's interesting. So it's not a use it or lose it when it comes to fat. It's use it or store it when it
Or
comes to fat.
exactly. Exactly.
Okay, that's important.
Yeah. And also where it gets stored, right? So estrogen helps us to store the fat where we want it the most, which is our subcutaneous tissue. So our skin can stay nice and hydrated and plump, and we don't lose, we don't shrivel up and turn into these old ladies that are just sort of bones and skeletal muscle. Our skin stays plump. Without estrogen, the fat storage ends up being more in our visceral fat, in between our organs, which then also sets us further up for cardiovascular disease.
That's right.
Yeah, estrogen, as we go into menopause and perimenopause, our risks for cardiovascular disease goes up, heart attacks, strokes. Well, estrogen plays a major role in that, and also has a direct effect on our cholesterol panel.
Mhm. Mhm.
HDL, which is our good cholesterol, will stay up. LDL cholesterol goes down with estrogen.
So estrogen is super protective when we're younger. We've talked about that. We've had lots of guests talk about the protective nature of estrogen. So what can we do, right? Because it's inevitable. We can't retain our estrogen forever. However, we know with some bioidentical hormone replacement are options, but we also know that there are things we can start doing younger, right? And as we are aging, that can help preserve that. So maybe we can talk a little bit about that.
Right. So because perimenopause starts sometimes decades before we really notice the symptoms,
Mhm.
that's really when we need to start to do something about it. And so the more muscle we can retain, the better. As we go into our 40s, cardiovascular exercise, getting our heart rates up, doesn't necessarily translate into a change in body composition anymore. At this age, it becomes much more important to build strength and to build muscle, because the first thing that goes is our type 2 muscle fibers. And those are the ones that are important for for speed. And we all know as we get older, we kind of slow down. So it's really important to keep those type 2 muscle fibers up, and strength training becomes much more important. We just don't respond to cardiovascular training the same way anymore.
So let's pause on that for a second, because when I walk into the gym, I would say it's almost exclusively women on the treadmills and the elliptical trainers. And I don't know if it's because it's a sense of community with everyone lined up, or that's just what we've always done in a gym, right? The weights can be somewhat intimidating if you walk into a gym, right? So I think women, not just women, but people that are less comfortable might navigate toward the cardiovascular stuff, because that's what we've always learned in the 80s. Remember, those were the times where we thought fat was bad too. So we learned a lot of bad stuff in the 80s. So I just want to highlight that, because that's so powerful, guys, right? The hour-long cardio sessions are not necessary, and they're not helping change the way your body composition is, how your fat is being stored and where it's stored. Brilliant. I didn't mean to interrupt you. I thought that was so awesome.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think we're very much intimidated, by those bodybuilders, and all the, like you said, the ellipticals are dominated by the women, the treadmills are dominated by the women, but then the weight section is all the big bodybuilding guys, and so that can be very intimidating. But I would make the argument that because it is so important to keep our muscle strength up for metabolic reasons, which we alluded to with insulin resistance and things like that, as a woman, as we age, once you get past 40, in order to keep making progress with your body composition, to keep your ability to lose fat up, you must build muscle. And I'm not just talking about the 5 pound toning dumbbells. I'm really encouraging women to do hard, you know, heavy weights. And one of my guidelines is, do 10 to 12 repetitions, but the last 2 repetitions should be almost not doable. And that's when you know that you have the right amount of weights, right? You want to really fatigue that muscle, and women, do not be afraid. You will not look like those big muscle building guys, right? But you have got um, to stress that muscle in order for it to grow, and you're not going to do that by lifting those 5 pound toning bells. So don't be
Which
afraid
was
to go.
another trend that came out of the 80s.
Yes. Well, we have evolved since, and we're learning more and more um, about that. So muscle strength is hugely important for women and our metabolism, especially as we age, if we don't want to slow down, to keep our metabolic capacity, our flexibility up. Muscles are also where a lot of our mitochondria are. Mitochondria is the powerhouse of our body, where we convert the nutrients into energy. Um, one of the one of the tools that I also use in my clinic as far as muscle building. So heavy weights, don't be afraid of heavy weights. And let's talk about leucine a little bit. So leucine is an amino acid that is very important for muscle building, and also it's one of our collagen building amino acids. So as we get wrinkles in our skin, is one of the amino acids that's missing or that's going low is the leucine. So I encourage women to add more leucine into their diet, even again, way before they start noticing these changes in their bodies. So in their 40s and their late 30s is a really good time to start thinking about, okay, how can I transition into this perimenopausal area very gracefully? And leucine is an amino acid that we can find a lot in whey protein, for example. So I encourage women to utilize whey protein if they can tolerate it, in lean meats, but we can also find it in Greek yogurt, or we can find it in nut butters as well.
Mm-hmm.
But just adding, several grams, 3 grams of leucine to your nutrition as you work out is another nice little tool that we use as women.
What's interesting is, and this, we didn't know this when we first started talking, but Ageless LX, one of the key ingredients is actually a derivative of leucine. The patented HMB in Ageless LX is what allows us to prevent muscle loss and increase muscle protein gains, and all the benefits that come along with leucine as we enhance our muscle mass. The
Wonderful.
timing on that was perfect.
Yes, yes, absolutely. And also not to be afraid of protein intake, especially older women. If you want to build your muscles, if you want to continue to be strong and to be active, you have got to keep your protein intake high. And I honestly, I don't care if it's a vegan protein or animal protein, that is a personal preference. But I definitely encourage women to increase their protein intake. To lose fat, you must keep your protein intake, at least 3 times a day at all the major meals. So another
That was
great.
my next question. So 3 times a day at least with major meals, um, to get adequate protein, a serving size of protein, and the serving sizes of protein in the US for a meal is usually adequate, yeah?
Well, I would say most women do not get adequate amount of protein. So really being mindful of, even when you start your day, what kind of protein are you eating? Are you getting enough? I usually aim for about 20 to 30 grams of protein per meal. And if
Mhm. Good.
active, you may need even more than that. So in general, depending on your activity level, 1 gram per body weight per day. So some women
Mhm.
go up to over 100 grams of protein a day, and it takes very you have to be really mindful about how you get enough protein into your meals, because just kind of snacking here and there and not paying attention won't get you up to 100 grams of protein per day.
No, it's a good point. And so some of the just in case, there are those folks out there that may not understand what we're talking about in terms of where they get their protein. Something like eggs, for instance, are a great source of protein.
One egg only has 6 to 7 grams of protein. So, several eggs plus maybe some nuts. I
Mhm.
love hemp seeds, by the way, for that matter, because it's a complete protein with all the amino acids, the essential amino acids. So,
Mhm. And they're great sprinkled on salads. If you've never tried hemp seed before, or they're wonderful. I keep them in the freezer and I just sprinkle them on top of salads, soups, anywhere I want texture. Sometimes I even
into a
will coat
smoothie,
my meats with it in a smoothie. That's a great place for it.
in a
Hmm.
smoothie, we do a lot of turmeric lattes, and to make them creamier, I will just mix some hemp seeds in the turmeric latte, so I get a little bit of protein. I get my
Mm,
anti-inflammatory curcumins. So it's a um, nice little treat.
sounds wonderful. Okay, so
Yeah.
all right, so let's take a step back and go through this idea that we had talked about insulin, insulin resistance. I know I've mentioned this before, but in case you didn't hear that episode, it's funny that when we have our labs drawn at an annual physical, what's fascinating is very often physicians will look at glucose. We know that. That's our blood sugar to
Hmm.
tell us how well we're managing our blood sugar. Some physicians will do a hemoglobin A1C, and that is kind of indicative of how well you manage your blood sugar over a 3-month period. But what's fascinating to me is it's not very common for physicians to run a fasting insulin.
Absolutely. I see this all the time. Yet it really is the insulin that helps me determine how metabolically healthy a person is. And Michelle, I can't tell you how many times I've seen an absolutely normal hemoglobin A1C. So, 5, 5.1, 5.2, 5.3, which of course is considered completely normal. But yet, when I then go and look at the insulin, people are making huge amounts of insulin to keep their hemoglobin A1C in a normal range. And then also just looking at the fasting blood sugar it's not the whole story either, because what I see many times that if women don't sleep well at night, they don't get a good night's sleep, they don't hit all the deep sleep stages, their fasting blood sugar will be a lot higher. So that really also doesn't
Mhm.
tell the whole story. As a matter of fact, the fasting blood sugar has a lot to do with cortisol and waking cortisol, and what does your nighttime cortisol do, your stress level overall. So you really have to look at all three of these aspects.
And to be clear, when we talk about insulin, it's fascinating that glucose became the thing we look at because it's really downstream of what's going on with insulin. Insulin is the one thing that you can't hide, right? Your body always wants to be stable and it will do what it needs to do to make that blood sugar stable. And if that means it needs your pancreas to pump out tons of insulin, that's what it will do to keep your blood sugar stable. So that's why we're saying know your fasting insulin or know your fed insulin. And when you understand what those numbers look like, you're in a much better position to understand if you're insulin resistant, because this is where I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, but this is where I think most women, especially perimenopausal and just postmenopausal, live in this space of being insulin resistant without ever knowing it. We eat healthy, we do some form of exercise, um, but maybe our stress levels are really high, especially coming out of our 40s with our children growing up. We're the mom's taxi. I always say I burn the candle on both ends and the middle just to make sure it was crispy. so,
Yes, yes,
so
exactly.
let's talk about that. Let's talk about insulin resistance and how we know and how that really mucks up the system.
Yeah. So, as we get older and starting in our 40s into our 50s, we don't utilize the carbohydrates the same way because of some hormonal changes. It has a lot to do with the sex steroid hormones, so estrogen, testosterone, progesterone, but it also has a lot to do with our cortisol. And just the way that our body is programmed, cortisol will go up almost automatically as we age. So the older we get, the higher our cortisol um, creeps up. And then you throw on top of that our stress levels, everything that we do with our kids and our work and living in modern society. We don't sleep well at night. We've probably lost a lot of our progesterone, our sleep hormone, early in our 40s because of the stress and the nutrition and what we do to our bodies, so that when we arrive in our mid to late 40s, we arrive there insulin resistant and completely stressed out. And so I always like to take a step back. What kind of a lifestyle are you leading? Are you, like you said, burning the candles on both ends? Because I would argue that most of us are, but if that's how we live our lives, we have to work just as hard at recovery as we work on other aspects of our health. So if we work out heavily and we do a lot of cardiovascular exercise, we have to put at least as much intensity into our recovery. So as we age, recovery becomes a lot more important, um, because cortisol just plays a huge role in our insulin resistance, and how we sleep at night sets your insulin response up for the next 24 hours. So think about that. So, you go to bed late, you don't get your 8 hours of sleep, you don't hit the deep sleep, you're lacking certain hormones. How do you start your day, and how are the next 24 hours dictated, as far as your insulin response? And then, as I mentioned before, insulin is the major fat storage hormone. The goal, therefore, should be to keep your insulin as low as possible in order to
So
stay.
increasing your protein naturally helps with that.
Increasing your protein naturally helps with that. Stress reduction in whatever shape or form that looks like for you helps with that.
So that could be prayer, that could be meditation, that could be just walking around the pond, walking your dog
I'm a
in a non-vigorous way.
I'm a huge fan of connecting with nature, which is shown to reduce cortisol by almost 40%. So, connection with nature, connection with others. As women, we're also wired to communicate with other women.
Mhm.
When I try to reduce my stress, I want to talk about it, right? I'm not like a
Mhm.
guy who's then going into the woods and chopping trees. I want to communicate with other women. I want to sit in that circle of other women and, de-stress this way by connection. So I think connecting is another huge way by which we can bring our cortisol levels down,
Mhm.
decrease our insulin resistance, decrease our stress response. And another benefit of decreasing cortisol as we age is it keeps our muscles strong, because cortisol is a catabolic hormone. Cortisol breaks down your muscle, it breaks down your skin, it breaks down your gut integrity. So work on stress resilience, keep up your protein. As you age, because we are more sensitive to carbohydrates, get rid of all the simple carbohydrates, the processed carbohydrates, and focus more on whole grains. I'm not saying carbohydrates are necessarily the bad guy as they have been made out to be recently, but stick to the whole grains and eat close to the earth. And just another thought on the whole, intermittent fasting and low carbohydrate diet, again, which most of the research has been done in men, but I see it backfire in a lot of women. We try so hard to be perfect and we eat less and less carbohydrates, and we fast longer and longer periods, and we want to keep up
Mhm.
with the guys who are
Mhm.
eating one meal a day, and they do great and they lose weight. But what happens many times to women, it affects their thyroid.
Mhm.
Cortisol shoots up, and we've
Mhm.
now seen how cortisol can be absolutely detrimental to our aging process.
Right.
So I think for women, it's important. And by the way, I've seen now many times when we overdo fasting and we overdo the low carbohydrate, it really affects our hormones. We lose those juicy sex steroid hormones, the estrogen, the testosterone, the progesterone.
Mhm.
So
Hmm.
especially for women, it's really important to not overdo it, to listen to your body, you are not just a small man. You're a woman, and our physiology is completely different when it comes to, fasting and insulin and how it all works. So,
It's remarkable because I believe, when I did my studies and even the latest research, all the biohacking, which really is anti-aging. I mean, we're talking about longevity, we're talking about ways to improve our trajectory from this point forward in our lives. And so most of the people leading that movement are men. And that's wonderful that they're leading that movement. But I love what you're saying because it's almost like we're the same species, right? We're both human, but at the same time, we work so differently. We are a complex symphony of hormones where men are fairly basic in their hormone dependency and structure, and they stay pretty constant their whole lives until
yeah.
much later, where we've got pregnancy in there, we've got puberty. We go through every 10 years, there's a hit that changes a woman's hormonal makeup. And and to me, it just feels like staying on top of that and finding a practitioner that understands that that's different um, is critical. And when you can't, finding things like this, that's why we created Evolving Ageless, because we know it's not a 180-degree shift overnight. We know that these are processes, and we take bits and pieces and we add them to our evolution. And as a woman, I feel like understanding that what's working for your husband, boyfriend, brother is not necessarily going to work for you. But the one huge takeaway here is don't be afraid of heavier weight.
Don't be
Don't,
afraid of heavier weight. Don't be afraid of your protein
right.
intake, and just shift your nutrition. Sometimes it just takes a tiny little shift. Sometimes it actually takes, take down your workout intensity, the cardiovascular intensity, just a tad bit, and it can make all the difference in a female hormone setup. And yes, we flow. Our monthly flow is different than the steady testosterone of a guy. So we have to look at women's physiology very differently. And I think I'm hoping that more and more of those biohacking research that's being done will be done on women as well, because I think we'll see how we have different demands on our bodies.
We needed a better word for women than biohacking too. It sounds so harsh
And
and aggressive.
right.
I'm open to that. I need a new one. Because I don't want to use the word biohacking because I don't think it resonates with women in their 50s or 60s or, 40s. It's just not a term that we resonate with. Yet there are some tenets in there of things that we can learn that we kind of shy away from because of the idea that it sounds so harsh and aggressive.
Right, I agree. The hacking is just so opposite from the female flow, right?
Yes, yes, right.
So
I
we
love
need to
it.
find this like female flow that serves
Yes.
our bodies.
I love it. Dr. Cook, I cannot thank you enough. And as a gift to our audience, Dr. Cook has a metabolic reset protocol that she's offering just as a free download. And so, again, you'll go to evolvingageless.com, and in our show notes will be all of the information about Dr. Cook, the things that we discussed today, and a link for the metabolic reset protocol. This has been fantastic. I know that we talk a lot about muscle, we talk a lot about estrogen, we talk a lot about working out, but not quite this way. This was fascinating and really eye-opening for me, and I'm sure for others, about the fact that those treadmills and those ellipticals and that you know d- eating less and less and less is not the solution. So thank you so much for helping us to evolve ageless.
Thank you so much, Michelle, for having me. It was a pleasure.
Oh, so great. And be sure to look up on the show notes and learn everything you can about Dr. Elka Cooke. Again, thanks so much. And in the meantime, continue living ageless. I'll see you next week.